London, the summer of 1305. The cobblestones of the city are slick with morning dew. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and something else. Something like fear. A crowd gathers, thousands deep, children sitting on shoulders, vendors selling meat pies. Laughter mingled with anticipation. They didn't come for a festival. They came for a man who had once made kings tremble, a man who now stood, bound and broken. His name was William Wallace. To most of England, he was a savage, a traitor. To Scotland, he was a warrior, a symbol of what freedom could look like. But what happened to him on that August day was never about justice. It was about domination. It was about erasing not just a man, but the very idea he stood for. To understand the horror of what was about to unfold, you need to understand what led William Wallace to this final moment. Medieval Scotland was chaos wrapped in iron. Kings died without heirs. Nobles switched loyalties like cloaks. And across the border, King Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, waited like a vulture. When Scotland faltered, he struck. Wallace was no prince, no polished nobleman. He was the son of a minor knight, raised in hardship. But when the English murdered his family, something in him broke, or maybe something awoke. He didn't rise with gold or titles, he rose with fury. In 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace led Scottish rebels into one of the most humiliating defeats ever dealt to an English army. His tactics were bold, brutal, effective. And for a fleeting moment, it seemed like Scotland might just be free. But freedom has a price, and England would never forget the name Wallace. For years, Wallace fought, not just English armies, but silence. Most Scottish nobles had bent the knee, not Wallace. He became a ghost, a myth, a shadow slipping between forests and flames. Until one day, someone whispered his name for the wrong ears to hear. The betrayal came quietly, as it always does. Sir John de Menteith, a fellow Scot turned collaborator, handed Wallace over near Glasgow. No grand battle, no heroic last stand, just ropes, chains, and silence. England had its prize, but King Edward I wasn't satisfied with just a capture. He wanted a message carved in agony. Wallace's journey to London was no transport. It was humiliation in slow motion. Stripped of dignity, paraded like a beast, he was dragged through English towns for weeks, bound in filth, spit on by crowds, displayed like a trophy. But he never begged, he never wept. They say he looked every jeering face in the eye, as if memorizing each soul who cheered his downfall. To the English, he was a monster, but the way they treated him revealed who the real monsters were. August 23rd, 1305, Westminster Hall. Wallace stood before a panel of judges who had already written his fate. He was charged with treason, sacrilege, and murder. But here's the twisted irony. Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward. In his final defiant words, he declared, "I cannot be a traitor to a king I never acknowledged." And with that, the court roared, but not in sympathy, in judgment. The sentence was chilling. He would be hanged, but not to death, cut open, while still breathing, his insides burned in front of his eyes, his body butchered into 4 parts, his head dipped in tar, and placed high above London Bridge, to watch the river flow beneath it for years to come. This wasn't justice. This was a performance, written in blood and cruelty. Dawn broke over London like any other summer day, but the air carried a different weight. It wasn't fog, it was fear. The city had been preparing for days. Wooden scaffolds were hammered into place. Vendors sold roasted meat and cheap ale to the waiting crowd. Children clutched their mothers' hands. Old men leaned on sticks. Everyone came, not for justice, but for entertainment. Because what they were about to witness was not an execution. It was medieval theater. Cruelty turned into spectacle. Wallace was tied to a hurdle, a wooden frame dragged through mud and stone. He was pulled from the Tower of London through the city's busiest streets. Cobblestones shredded his skin, every bump a fresh wound. The crowd roared, Some jeered, some laughed, some simply stared, watching a legend be dragged like meat to slaughter. No sword, no armor, no voice, just the eyes of a man who refused to break. At Smithfield, the scaffold loomed above the crowd like a dark altar. Wallace was hoisted up and hanged by the neck, but not to kill him, just enough to choke, to burn. As his body convulsed, they cut him down, alive. What came next? Silence. Even the crowd stopped breathing. The executioner pulled a knife. With slow, deliberate cruelty, he opened Wallace's abdomen and pulled out his entrails. Wallace was still conscious, his face pale, his mouth bloodied, but his eyes were still open. One by one, each organ was held high, then thrown into a fire as Wallace watched. The crowd gasped. Some turned away, others cheered, but everyone knew this was no ordinary death. Finally, when his breath turned to shudder, the executioner raised his axe. One clean stroke, the head fell, blood spilled, and the crowd cheered. The execution wasn't over. Not even in death was Wallace granted peace. The executioner took his blade again, but this time, not to kill, but to divide. His arms were removed, his legs hacked apart, blood spilled over the wooden scaffold like spilled ink on a death warrant. One by one, the body parts were wrapped in cloth, labeled for their destinations. Wallace wasn't just executed, he was disassembled. A human body turned into 4 warnings. His head, blackened with tar, was hoisted on a spike above London Bridge. It stayed there for years. Eyes once fierce, now empty, staring at the Thames as it flowed like time itself. The 4 quarters of his body, sent to Scotland, one to Newcastle, another to Berwick, one to Stirling, where he had once won a nation's hope, and one to Perth, where hope had bled. These weren't random choices. This was message warfare. Challenge England, and you'll end like this. Thousands had cheered, laughed, some fainted, some sold souvenirs, but all of them were witnesses. They saw what happens when a man becomes a symbol, when the body is no longer flesh, but language. Wallace's execution was not just physical, it was psychological, spiritual, a medieval ritual of fear. And yet, it backfired. King Edward believed he had killed a rebellion, but he had done something far worse. He had created a martyr. Wallace's death didn't silence Scotland, it ignited it. His dismembered body became a map, not of fear, but of rage. Across the north, whispers grew into roars, and within years, Robert the Bruce rose, not with words, but with fire and steel. What Edward tried to destroy became Scotland's rallying cry. Wallace had no crown, no grand army, just one man's refusal to bow. His death was designed to break spirits. Instead, it carved courage into a nation's bones. In every battlefield that followed, soldiers whispered his name. In every tavern, mothers told their children of the man who died in pieces, but never surrendered. They took his life, but they couldn't take his cause. Even centuries later, his name bleeds through stone statues, battlefield ruins, and freedom songs. He did not live to see Scotland rise, but without his fall, it never would have stood. In the heart of London, long after the cheers died, his tarred head watched silently from that bridge, a face meant to warn, but it became something else entirely, a symbol of defiance, a ghost that refused to vanish. William Wallace didn't just die, he was reborn in every generation that chooses resistance over submission. And that is why his execution was far more horrifying than you imagine. If this story sent chills down your spine, hit like and subscribe. More brutal truths from history's darkest corners are coming. Until next time, stay curious, stay haunted,